Well, thank you for the introduction. My name's Ethan Cecchetti. I'm a third-year PhD student at Cornell University. I'm going to be talking about non-malleable information flow control. This is joint work with Andrew Myers, who's also at Cornell, and Owen Arden, who's at UC Santa Cruz. So information flow control is a very useful tool for building secure systems. It provides a very strong set of security guarantees, and it can be enforced in a variety of manners, from type systems to other static analyses or runtime mechanisms like information flow monitors. Unfortunately, it's often criticized for being overly restrictive for real-world applications. In particular, many real-world applications require downgrading, so either making confidential information less secret or making untrustworthy data more trusted. And these downgrading mechanisms break the classical strong security guarantees provided by information flow control. In this work, we introduced two new notions of security for information flow control that provide very strong guarantees even for programs that downgrade information. In order to enforce the classic guarantees, information flow labels data in a program so it can track how different inputs affect various outputs. It can track how information flows through the program. In this work, we track both confidentiality or secrecy of data and integrity or trustworthiness. These two notions are really dual to each other. And what I mean by that is that for confidentiality, public information or less confidential information flows to more confidential or more secret information. So as we increase the confidentiality, the policies get more restrictive. There's less we can do with the data. Whereas integrity is the other way around. As integrity gets higher, as data gets more trustworthy, the policies get less restrictive. There's more we can do with the data. In this work, all of the data is labeled with both a confidentiality and an integrity. So we represent these as a simple two-dimensional lattice that has confidentiality along one dimension and integrity along the other. As I mentioned, this is frequently criticized for being overly restrictive. As an example, let's look at a sealed bid auction where we have Alice and Bob both bidding on some widget. This is a sealed bid auction, so both of them determine their bids independently. They send it to the auctioneer, and then the auctioneer is able to determine who won the auction and output a winner. If we want to if we want to specify the security properties of this using information flow labels, it's a sealed bid auction, so we don't want Alice and Bob to be able to read each other's bids at the beginning, so we'll need to label those as secret. We also can't trust Alice and Bob. We assume they might cheat if given the opportunity, so we want to label their bids as untrusted as well. This secret and untrusted label lands at the top of the lattice, which means that it's a highly restrictive label. There's very little that this data can influence. The winner, however, needs to be public and trusted. Everyone needs to be able to see who won the auction, and everyone needs to trust that the auction winner was computed properly. This public and trusted label lands at the bottom of the lattice. It's very permissive. Uh, Unfortunately, classic information flow says that there's no influence allowed here. These secret and untrusted bids can't influence the public and trusted winner of the auction at all. This is clearly not the behavior of an auction that we want. And so, in order to implement this auction properly using these security policies, we need some means to downgrade the data and allow this influence to happen. There are two types of downgrading. For confidentiality, we can declassify data, so we take secret information and we make it more public. This is, say, after we've computed the output of the auction using secret data, it's marked as secret. We want to then declassify that result so everyone can read it. For integrity, we have endorsement. This is where we take untrustworthy data and we make it more trusted. So maybe we have some input coming from an untrustworthy user, and we need to incorporate that input into trusted computation, and so we need to endorse the input. Unfortunately, if we just allow for arbitrary declassification and endorsement, we lose all of the strong security guarantees that information flow is designed to provide. There are a few reasons for this, but one of them stems from the fact that information flow labels provide a specification of the security of a program. They don't prescribe any particular implementation. And one of the benefits of this is that they can be used to make sure there aren't any implementation specific exploits. But if we allow for downgrading, then those implementation specific exploits may go completely undetected. So if we have a distributed system and we're enforcing our information flow policies using a cryptographic mechanism, then maybe we'll improperly trust data that was modified due to, say, a malleable encryption scheme or something of that sort. because we endorsed data. We could also enforce our policies using a shared memory system where we had multiple processes. But if there were leaks if there's poor isolation and there were leaks between the different processes, a declassification may cause that leak to go undetected. We could also enforce our policies using a trusted hardware mechanism. But in this case, a downgrade of some sort could allow for a bug in the program to improperly provide secret data to an untrusted operating system or take information from that operating system and consider it trusted when it shouldn't be. As a specific example, let's look at this auction again. So we still have Alice and Bob bidding on some widget, and the auction is being administered by an auctioneer who is trusted by both Alice and Bob. So Alice and Bob trust the auctioneer to act on their behalf and to properly implement their security policies. Alice first determines her bid, which she marks as top secret because this is a sealed bid auction, so she doesn't want Bob to be able to read it. Top secret means that only the auctioneer can read the data. Alice then sends this top secret bid to the auctioneer, and the auctioneer endorses Alice's bid. This endorsement means that Alice will be unable to modify the bid later, and this is important for properly implementing Bob's security policies because Bob doesn't want Alice to be able to change her bid after she's committed to it. Bob then does the same thing. He computes his bid, which he marks as top secret for the same reason, sends it to the auctioneer endorses Bob's bid. Once the auctioneer has received both bids and they've both been committed to, he's able to determine the winner and reveal that information to both Alice and Bob. This seems like a perfectly reasonable specification for an auction, but unfortunately it's insecure. If Bob is acting a bit malicious here, Bob's trying to cheat, maybe he finds a way to intercept Alice's bid. Alice's bid is marked as top secret, so Bob can't read Alice's bid, but he might be able to compute something with Alice's bid as long as the output of that computation is at least as secret as Alice's bid was. So it has to be at least top secret. But remember, Bob's bid is top secret. So that means Bob could say, take Alice's bid and add 1 to it, and produce a perfectly valid top secret bid that he can use as his own bid. The auctioneer will then accept that as Bob's bid, and Bob will always win the auction by $1. He won't even know what he bid until the end. He'll just know that he's going to win the auction by $1. This is not the behavior we want out of an auction. So what went wrong here? At first, it may look like the problem was that Bob was able to compute something using Alice's bid. This isn't inherently problematic as long as the output of that computation is at least as secret as the input. The auctioneer, however, was willing to accept this bid that Bob had computed with Alice's data. And from Alice's perspective, this is really not trustworthy behavior. Alice was trusting the auctioneer to act on her behalf, and the auctioneer accepted this cheating bid that Alice would not consider trustworthy. And so we need a way to check whether or not the auctioneer is behaving in a trustworthy fashion. There are a few notions of security that have existed previously in information flow literature in this regard. The classic one is non-interference. Non-interference simply says there's no data leakage whatsoever. Unfortunately, this is exactly the strong guarantee that's lost by any form of downgrading. There has been some prior work into how to downgrade safely. In particular, robust declassification defines a notion of secure declassification that says we can only declassify data when it's sufficiently trusted. This prevents an attacker from controlling what information is declassified or when that information is declassified. And this is really nice, but unfortunately, it's only enforceable when the program declassifies but does not endorse. As I mentioned at the beginning, we introduced 2 new notions of security in this work. The first one is called transparent endorsement. This is a dual notion to robust declassification and defines a notion of secure endorsement. Transparent endorsement says that information has to be sufficiently public to endorse it. And in fact, as we'll see in a minute, what went wrong in the auction was that Bob's bid was too secret and the auctioneer was still willing to endorse it. Now, much like robust declassification, transparent endorsement is only enforceable when a program endorses data but does not declassify. And so this leads to our second new security condition of non-malleable information flow, which combines both robust declassification and transparent endorsement into a single condition that we can enforce even for programs that both declassify and endorse data. For now, I'm going to talk about transparent endorsement, and let's go back and look at the endorsements that happened in this auction. As I mentioned, in order for the auctioneer to be considered trustworthy, he really needs to ensure that Bob constructed his own bid independently of Alice's secrets. And in order to make this guarantee, the auctioneer needs to ensure that Bob can read his own bid. If Bob can read his own bid, then that means that Bob couldn't possibly have used Alice's bid to construct his unless he could already read Alice's bid, which he can't. That's the point of the sealed bid auction. So to enforce this, we need to change these two labels, and we need to make them less secret. Instead of them both being top secret, Alice's bid needs to be Alice secret, and Bob's bid needs to be Bob's secret. This means that the auctioneer can still read both bids, and both Alice and Bob can read their own bids, but they can't read each other's bids. This is, in some sense, very surprising because we've seen here that by simply increasing the confidentiality of the bids, we've damaged the security of our auction. And that is a little bit counterintuitive, but it turns out to be very important here. And if we generalize this solution, sorry, and this prevents Bob from actually using Alice's bid. So if we generalize this solution, we arrive at the general enforcement mechanism for transparent endorsement. And the intuition behind this enforcement mechanism is that we shouldn't endorse data unless the provider of that data can actually read it. So we shouldn't endorse Bob's data unless Bob is able to read that data. And to see how we do this, we'll look at our lattice of labels. And if we start with Bob's bid, in order to check whether or not we can endorse Bob's bid, we'll first check the confidentiality of Bob's bid. This is Bob's secret. And then we'll convert this confidentiality into an associated integrity level. In this case, that's Bob trusted. And now we can check whether the bid was at least as trustworthy as this Bob trusted label. If it's less trustworthy than Bob trusted, then this means that the provider of the data was not authorized to read Bob's secret data. The provider of the data couldn't read the data, and it's dangerous to endorse it. If it's at least Bob trusted, then the provider of the data was authorized to read the data, and it's perfectly fine to endorse it. And in fact, we can enforce this using a typing rule in an information flow type system, which says that if we want to endorse a value X and put it into a value with Y that has some label, we can relate the integrity of X, the integrity of Y, and this confidentiality to integrity flip that I described a moment ago. This rule down here essentially means exactly the same thing as the lattice that I just described. So now that we have this nice, concise typing rule, we can try to apply it to our insecure auction, and we want to make sure that something goes wrong here. So this is some pseudocode for the insecure version of the auction, where both bids are labeled as top secret. First, the auctioneer endorses Alice's bid, then the auctioneer endorses Bob's bid, which Bob is cheating, so it's just Alice's bid plus one, and then the auctioneer determines the winner and declassifies the result. If we attempt to apply this typing rule to the second line, we want to see that something goes wrong here. So we substitute the values in, and first we'll check the integrity of Bob's bid. Bob provided this value, so this is Bob trusted. And then we look at the integrity that the auctioneer is trying to endorse it to. This is fully trusted. The auctioneer is trying to make it fully trusted. And now we have to convert the confidentiality of the value into integrity. Remember that these bids were marked as top secret, so the confidentiality of Bob's bid here is top secret, which means the associated integrity is fully trusted. And this means that in order for this to type check, we would need Bob trusted to flow to fully trusted. But remember that more trustworthy information flows to less trustworthy, not the other way around. So indeed, as we were hoping, this does not type check. One of the nice things about transparent endorsement is that it's completely dual to robust declassification. Transparent endorsement says that in order to endorse data, the confidentiality policy needs to be sufficiently permissive. It needs to be sufficiently public. Robust declassification says that in order to declassify data, the integrity policy has to be sufficiently permissive. It has to be sufficiently trustworthy. And indeed, the typing rules are also exactly dual to each other. So down on the left, we see the typing rule for transparent endorsement that I had up on the previous slide. And on the right is the typing rule for robust declassification that's existed in prior work. And this is exactly the same rule. I just changed integrity to confidentiality and confidentiality to integrity. So this is great. We have this nice means of enforcing a security policy for what constitutes secure endorsement, but we haven't really defined what that security guarantee is. And we've defined our endorsement in a syntactic sense. So this means that it's defined in terms of the syntax of the program, the structure of the program code itself. We'd like our security guarantee to be a semantic guarantee so that it's only concerned with the behavior of the program, not with the structure of the code. And in order to do this, we define our security guarantee in terms of program traces that contain no syntactic information at all. And the intuition here is that we don't want Alice's secret information to influence endorsement of Bob's data. So if we look at our untrusted auction and we run it twice, but keep everything the same except for Alice's bid. We only change Alice's bid, and for example, maybe Alice bids either $10 or $5. We can check whether or not Bob's endorsed data is the same. So in both cases, we see a bunch of things happen that are not endorsements of Bob's data. And then if Alice bid $10, we see an endorsement of Bob's bid for $11, whereas if Alice bid $5, we see an endorsement of Bob's bid for $6. And in this case, the only thing we changed was Alice's bid, but we saw a difference in the result of this endorsed value for Bob's bid. So this is not secure according to our definition of transparent endorsement. Unfortunately, we can't just look at a single trace that has values and information flow labels and see an endorsement occur. We just know how trusted and secret information is. We don't know that this was a specific point of endorsement, so we need a way to semantically identify when an endorsement occurs. And to do this, we recognize that the point of an endorsement is to take untrustworthy information and make it more trustworthy. And so this means that we can identify a semantic endorsement when an untrustworthy input influences a trustworthy value. And so we're going to run the same experiment we did before, where we run the program twice, but instead of modifying Alice's bid, we're instead going to modify Bob's untrustworthy bid. So in this case, we'll say Alice bid $10, and Bob's untrustworthy bid is either Bob being honest and just picking $6, or Bob cheating and adding 1 to Alice's bid. In the first case, the first trustworthy value we see from Alice's perspective is Alice's bid. Alice bids $10, and then we see some untrustworthy values, and then when the auctioneer endorses Bob's bid, we see a trustworthy value of Bob's bid at $6. In the second case, we again see Alice's bid of $10, followed by some untrustworthy values, and then when Bob's bid gets endorsed, it becomes a trustworthy value of $11. We can now look at these two traces together and see if we can find an endorsement. The first value is not an endorsement. This is the same value in both cases. Changing the untrustworthy input didn't change the trustworthy value, so we don't see an endorsement. But in the second case, all we did was change Bob's untrustworthy input, and we see a different value for the trustworthy output. So we have here semantically identified that an endorsement has occurred. And we can use this technique and apply it to the traces that we had before, where we were trying to check that Alice's secret didn't influence endorsement of Bob's data. So instead of having one trace for each of these Alice secrets, we need to identify when endorsements occur, so we have 2. And we change Bob's untrustworthy bid for the 2 traces. In the first case, when Alice bid $10, we indeed see the endorsement that I had on the previous slide, either Bob bids $11 or Bob bids $6. But in the second case, when Alice bids $5, we don't even necessarily see an endorsement here. Bob bids $6 either way, so we semantically can't identify this as an endorsement. And we see that Alice's secret bid was able to influence whether or not semantically an endorsement occurred at all. And this demonstrates an insecurity in the program from the perspective of transparent endorsement. However, if we modify the auction and use the secure version of the auction, Bob can no longer cheat, and so the best Bob can possibly do is pick a different value, say $3 for his bid. And in this case, when Alice bids $10, Bob either bids 6 or 3, and when Alice bids $5, Bob also either bid 6 or 3. And in fact, these two would match regardless of what values I picked for Alice's secret and Bob's bid. And so this endorsement is transparent. The transparent endorsement condition considers this secure. Now, since this property is defined using 4 traces, it's actually what's called a 4 hyperproperty, which is a general way of classifying behaviors of programs. And we're particularly excited because this is the first naturally occurring 4 hyperproperty for information security. Now, up to this point, I've spent a lot of time discussing the auction, up through the point where the auctioneer endorsed Bob's bid. But you may remember that that wasn't actually the end of the auction. After the auctioneer endorsed Bob's bid, he determined the winner and revealed the result. And in 3 of these cases, he declassifies that Alice won the auction. But in the 4th case, when Bob bid $6 and Alice bid 5, Bob won the auction. Now, this auction is actually secure, but transparent endorsement and robust declassification both require that we be able to pair up traces in this way and have them match each other. And clearly, that's not the case if we see Alice for 3 traces and Bob for 1. So while this auction is secure, neither of these 2 conditions can actually recognize that. And we need a condition that can. And this leads us to non-malleable information flow, which is a security property that can be enforced when we have both declassification and endorsement. You'll remember I said that robust declassification and transparent endorsement can only be enforced when we have one. And the reason for that is that downgrades can influence each other. So declassified data can influence endorsements because the declassified data is now public. So it's perfectly fine for it to influence future endorsements. Similarly, endorsed data is now trustworthy, so it's perfectly fine for that to influence future declassifications. And in order to account for this, instead of looking at the entire trace of the program execution, we look at trace prefixes. And we say that if the trace prefixes are trusted equivalent, so the trusted information matches across the trace prefixes, then the declassifications have to match, in the same way that robust declassification requires them to match. Similarly, if the traces are public equivalent, so the public information matches across the trace prefixes, then the endorsements have to match in the same way that transparent endorsement requires. And when we put these 2 trace prefix conditions together, we arrive at non-malleable information flow, which is a very strong condition. It allows downgrades to influence each other in a secure fashion, but doesn't allow for, say, secret information that has not been declassified to influence endorsements. So what have we done here? We've introduced 2 new semantic security notions and a way to enforce them with a type system. We've introduced transparent endorsement, which defines a notion of secure endorsement and is dual to robust declassification. And we've introduced non-malleable information flow, which combines robust declassification and transparent endorsement into a single property that's enforceable for programs that both declassify and endorse data. We've also characterized all of these properties as 4 safety hyperproperties, which are the first naturally occurring 4 safety hyperproperties for information security. We also figured out a way around some concerns regarding downgrading of complex data structures with heterogeneous data labels that will actually occur in practical situations. And we have an implementation of this that's as a Haskell GHC plugin. And so with that, I would like to thank everyone for their attention, and I would now take questions. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, so our security definitions are the way that we define our labels is generalized so that we can have an arbitrary number of participants in the lattice, and we can essentially assign labels for each of them, and then combine them however we want. So if we also had Charlie and Dave in the auction, we would just give Charlie and Dave their own labels, and everything still works. Mhm. Yep. Yeah, so it's the question of we didn't really address the question of how we dynamically create new labels to systems that have a varying number of users. If we have a cap on the number of users, then we can just statically allocate all of those up front. But I think the question of how to dynamically allocate new labels from a theory standpoint, we assume an infinite number of labels, so that's not a problem. From a practical standpoint, that's not a question we addressed.
Yeah, I was wondering which dimension of the classification are you considering in your semantic condition? Is a who dimension and a where
Which
dimension of the
dimension of
yeah?
we define declassification in a dual way to how we define endorsement semantically. So it's simply two traces where the inputs differ on secret values and the outputs differ on public values.
Right. But it's about who endorse and who
Ah,
declassifies, right? And
we
exactly,
don't we don't consider who's doing the endorsement in the declassification. We only consider the labels of the endorsed and declassified data after the downgrade has occurred.
right, right. Can you explain a little bit more about the Haskell plugin?
Yeah, so the Haskell plugin is we have a core calculus that's essentially it's a variant of polymorphic DCC, which is based off of a system F polymorphic lambda calculus, and with information flow labels, and we have an implementation in as a GHC plugin that we can actually specify code in that core calculus. It's a core calculus, so it's a little bit clunky to program in, but we can specify code in that core calculus, and it will compile and run the code.
Do you think that perhaps you don't need a GLC plugin, that you can do it like just in Haskell?
Very possibly.
Right.
Yeah,
All
very
right.
possibly.
Thanks.
I'll ask the embarrassing question.
Yeah.
So the motivation for this work was that it would allow us to write practical programs, right? So we want declassification and endorsement because it allows us to write practical programs. Have you written any practical programs for this?
We have written a debatably practical program with it, but I think a more complete answer to that is that we defined this condition and proved our guarantees on a core calculus, and it's very hard to implement practical programs with a core calculus. So I think we would need a more complete language in order to really write a practical program. But there's no reason we couldn't just extend the same ideas into a more complete language.